Nobody warns you about the moment that ruins everything. There is no alarm, no flashing light, no voice that says, stop, think, breathe, because what you are about to do will follow you for the rest of your living days. There's just a second. One ordinary, forgettable second. And then there's the thing you did inside it. And then there's the rest of your life carrying it. Camilla did not think about any of that on the morning it happened. She was 23 years old, angry in the specific way that young women get angry when the world is pressed on them from too many directions for too long. And she was standing in a crowd outside Buckingham Palace on a gray Tuesday in late autumn when Queen Charlotte, 81 years old, fragile as a paper fan, the most recognized face in the entire kingdom, passed within 4 feet of her. And Camilla Ashworth spat on her, not by accident, not because of a sneeze or a stumble or any of the dozen small mercies that might have excused it. She leaned forward, gathered herself, and she spat. Right there, in the open air, in front of 40 witnesses, 6 palace security officers, 2 BBC camera crews, and the entire slow grind of history. The crowd went silent the way crowds only go silent when they have witnessed something that cannot be taken back. Then, everyone started screaming at once. To understand what happened in that 4-foot space between a young woman and a queen, you have to go back further. Not to that morning, not to the demonstration that brought Camilla to those iron gates, but to the girl she was before any of this, to the Camilla who existed in a world where spitting on royalty was not something that lived inside her, as even a remote possibility. She grew up in Swindon, which is the kind of town that people from London mention when they want to illustrate something about ordinariness. Row houses the color of old dishwater, a high street with 3 charity shops, and a Greg's. A father who worked nights at a logistics warehouse, and came home smelling of diesel and saying very little. A mother who had opinions about everything and the energy to share them constantly, who read the news like it was personal correspondence from enemies, who taught Camilla from the age of 7 that the world was divided between the people who had things and the people who worked themselves hollow so that those people could keep having them. Camilla absorbed this the way children absorb everything their mothers give them, without knowing she was absorbing it, without filing it under worldview or politics or class consciousness. It just became the water she swam in, the thing the world tasted like. She was not a difficult child. Teachers described her as bright, a little intense, prone to arguing about fairness in ways that were exhausting, but not wrong. She had friends, a decent enough social life, a brief and embarrassing phase of wanting to be a veterinarian that ended when she realized she could not watch things suffer without it staying with her for weeks. She was sensitive in the way that gets misread as difficult. She felt things at full volume when everyone around her had the dial turned to 3. At 18, she got into the University of Bristol on a student loan that her mother circled in red pen and called the first bill they send you before the real ones start. She studied politics and sociology, which her father said was not a proper subject, and which turned out to be the only thing she had ever encountered that gave language to everything she had been carrying since childhood without a name for it. Bristol opened her up in ways she was not prepared for. She found people who read the same thing she read and stayed up past 2 in the morning arguing about them. She found a professor named Dr. Osei who had a habit of asking and who benefits from that arrangement after every single political statement anyone made, until the question became reflexive, became the lens through which she processed the entire world. She found the university's activist collective a loose group of students and community members who organized around housing rights, welfare cuts, and what they called the performance of monarchy in a cost-of-living crisis. That last phrase was not hers, but it stuck inside her like a splinter. She was not radicalized in any dramatic way. There was no single book, no single conversation, no single event that flipped a switch. It was slower than that, and more boring, a long accumulation of reading and listening and watching and comparing, the way water eventually wears through stone, not because of any one wave, but because of all of them every day without stopping. By her 2nd year, she was organizing with the collective. By her 3rd year, she was leading 2 of its working groups. She graduated with a first-class degree. For 1,000 Instagram followers who came to her for political commentary delivered in the form of voice notes she recorded while walking, and a specific burning anger about the British monarchy that had gone from background noise to the loudest thing in the room. The monarchy, to Camilla, was not neutral. It was not tradition in the gentle sense, not a piece of history preserved in amber for national comfort. It was a working institution, publicly funded, deeply connected to the structural inequalities she had spent her entire adult education mapping. The palaces, the jewels, the land, the civil list payments. The way deference to the royal family got woven into the fabric of public life until criticizing it felt, to most people, like criticizing gravity. Not something you did, not something you even thought to do, because it had always been there. She did not hate Queen Charlotte personally. That was the complicated part, the part that would get lost in every headline that followed. She did not lie awake, imagining harm to an 81-year-old woman. She thought about systems. She thought about what the system required from people like her family and what it gave back, and the math had never balanced, and the Queen was the face on the front of the system, and that was what Camilla carried with her to London on that Tuesday in November. The demonstration had been organized by a coalition group called Republic Now. Not her organization, but affiliated, sharing members, sharing the specific grammar of protest that had developed on the British left over the past decade. The issue was straightforward. Cuts to pensioner benefits announced the previous month, a package of reductions that would pull money from the oldest and most vulnerable people in the country, announced in the same week that the palace released its annual financial report showing a 7% increase in the sovereign grant. 7% up. Pensioner benefits down. The math, again, did not balance. 300 people came to London for it. Teachers, nurses, retired council workers, young people who had been priced out of every city they tried to live in, people in their 60s who had paid into the system for 40 years and were now being told the system could not quite afford them. Camilla stood among them with a printed placard that read, "They feast, we freeze," which she had made herself at her kitchen table the night before, using a marker that kept bleeding through the cardboard and staining her fingers blue. The march moved down the mall. It was cold in the specific damp way that London gets in November, the kind of cold that goes straight through your coat before you've walked 50 meters. People around her were singing, chanting, doing the things that demonstrations do. Camilla was not singing. She was watching. She was watching the tourists on the pavement who took photographs of the marchers with the same interest they took photographs of the palace gates. Everything equally spectacle, equally distant from their real lives. She was watching the police officers who lined the route, faces professional and blank, the absolute neutrality of institutional authority on display. She was watching the palace gates themselves, gold and black and impractical, the grammar of power expressed in iron. Nobody had planned for Queen Charlotte to appear. The official itinerary, released the previous day, as royal itineraries always were, had her an engagement in Windsor. Something about a hospital opening, a new wing, the usual ribbon and photograph and careful handshake. She was not supposed to be in London. She was not supposed to be in a car moving slowly through the crowd of well-wishers that had gathered spontaneously at the palace's side entrance, because the palace had apparently decided at the last minute that a brief public appearance would be good for morale in the context of the ongoing benefit cuts coverage. Someone in the palace communications office thought this was a good idea. They were wrong. The car appeared at 11:47 in the morning. A dark Jaguar, moving at walking pace, with two protection officers flanking it on foot. The crowd shifted. The chanting faltered. Some people raised their signs higher. Some people pressed forward. The tourists found better angles. The police moved to maintain the line. Camilla was near the front. She had not pushed to be there. The crowd had simply compressed around the appearance of something to look at, and she had ended up closer to the car than she intended. She could see Queen Charlotte through the window. The white hair, the familiar profile, the slight wave, practiced and mechanical and absolutely disconnected from the 300 people who had walked through the cold to say, "This is not enough. We need more. See us." She would say later in interviews, in the police statement, in the courtroom, that she could not entirely account for what happened next. She would say that she had not planned it. She would say that something broke open inside her. Not rage, exactly. Not the hot theatrical rage she had felt at 100 demonstrations before this one, but something colder and more precise, something that lived below language, that predated the political education and the university and the collective and all the careful framework she had built for her anger. Something that went all the way back to the town the color of dishwater and the red pen circling the loan amount and the father who came home smelling of diesel and saying very little because there was very little at the end of that kind of day left to say. The window was open 3 inches. The car was 4 feet away. She leaned forward. She did not think about consequences the way consequences are supposed to present themselves, as a row of doors, as a choice architecture, as a before and after with a visible scene between them. The consequences did not arrive in time. They came after. Everything came after. The sound the crowd made was not a single thing. It was several things braided together: shock, disgust, a kind of collective gasp that is also a step backward, a physical distancing from what has just been witnessed. Some people shouted. Some people went very still. The protection officers moved. The car stopped moving. Camilla stood where she was. She did not run. She did not push through the crowd. She did not do any of the things that a person fleeing a mistake does. She just stood there with her blue-stained fingers wrapped around her placard that said they feast, we freeze, in the November cold, watching the consequence of 1 second arriving from every direction at once. An officer had her by the arm before she had finished processing that he was there. You're under arrest, he said. Do not resist. She did not resist. She thought about her mother. It was a strange thought to have in that specific moment, but it was the one that arrived, her mother in the Swindon row house, reading the news like correspondence from enemies, teaching her daughter without knowing she was teaching her that the world belonged to some people and not others, and that this was not natural, not neutral, not something you accepted without account. She thought, she's going to see this on the news. Then the officer's hand tightened on her arm, and she stopped thinking about her mother and started thinking about what came next. She did not know, yet what came next. Nobody told her it might be life. The charge sheet would come later. The lawyers would come later. The headlines would come within the hour. Woman spits on Queen Charlotte outside palace, arrested on scene, spreading across every news platform in the country, and then, within 3 hours, across every news platform in the world. Her face was everywhere before she made her one phone call. She used it to call her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring. There was the sound of the television in the background. The news. Already the news. Mom, Camilla said. A long silence. I know, her mother said. I'm watching it right now. Another silence. Longer. Are you hurt? No, Camilla said. Okay, her mother said. And then, quieter in the voice she used when she was controlling something she did not want to release. Okay. That was all. That was the whole conversation. Camilla sat in the holding cell with the phone back in the officer's hand, and the blue stain still on her fingers, and the specific quality of a silence that comes after you have done something that cannot be undone, something that has already left your body and become a public fact, something that belongs to the world now in a way that none of your private reasons ever will. Outside, the news cycle was already metabolizing her, already turning her into a symbol, for which symbol depended entirely on who was doing the turning. To some, she was the face of a dangerous disrespect, of a generation that had abandoned civility, of something broken and threatening in the national character. To others, she was the inevitable product of a system that had pressed on people long enough. A human being pushed past a breaking point in public, the cost of living crisis made flesh in one terrible, indelible second. Neither version was entirely her. Neither version was entirely wrong. She sat in the holding cell and did not cry. She thought about that later, that she did not cry. She thought about what that meant about who she had become, or maybe who she had always been, or maybe just about what it does to a person to have been carrying something for so long that when it finally comes out, there's no grief in it. Only the blue stain on her fingers. Only the cold. Only the thing that could not be taken back, already on its way to everywhere. The British legal system moves like a glacier, with total indifference to how cold you are while you wait for it. Camilla Ashworth spent 48 hours in a holding cell before she was formally charged. 48 hours during which the world outside compressed her into every shape it needed her to be. The lawyers assigned to her case, 2 of them young, from a civil liberties firm that had taken the case pro bono with the specific speed of people who recognized a historic moment when one landed in their inbox, briefed her in a small room with a laminate table on what she was facing, and the briefing took longer than she expected because the legal landscape around what she had done was not as simple as she had assumed. She had assumed she would be charged with assault. Common assault, perhaps. A fine. A community order. The kind of charge that carries weight symbolically, but does not reshape a life. She was wrong about that. The charge was assault on the sovereign, under an act of parliament that predated her grandmother's birth by over a century. It was not a charge that was used often. It was not a charge that most people in the country knew existed, including most lawyers, including the 2 young women sitting across from her who had had to look up the precise parameters of the statute the night before and had come into the briefing room with the controlled expressions of people delivering news they had not fully absorbed themselves. The maximum sentence, Asterisk the one named Priya said, not flinching away from it, which Camilla later identified as the thing she respected most about her, is life imprisonment. The room was very quiet. Life, asterisk Camilla said. It has never been applied at that level for anything comparable to your case, asterisk Priya said. Asterisk the most recent prosecutions under this act involve a man who threw an egg at King Charles in 2022 and received a suspended sentence, and a protester in 2019 who made physical contact with a royal vehicle and was fined. The statute exists primarily as a deterrent and as a vehicle for the Crown to signal the seriousness with which it treats. Asterisk, but it's possible, asterisk Camilla said. Priya did not answer immediately. It is legally possible, asterisk she said. Finally, asterisk the prosecution will not seek life. Our assessment is that they will seek a custodial sentence of between 2 and 5 years, depending on how aggressively they frame the political context. The concern is, asterisk, she paused in the way that lawyers pause when they are translating something complicated into something a client can hold without falling apart. The concern is that the current government has a political interest in treating this as more than a simple assault case. There's an election next year. The monarchy remains the most broadly popular institution in the country. How they respond to this, how aggressively they pursue it, send a message. And messages in election year have value. Asterisk Camilla looked at the table. So I'm a message, asterisk she said. You're a case, asterisk Priya said carefully. But cases exist in context. This was the thing that her political education had taught her to understand, and that her emotional reality in that room had temporarily made it very hard to hold. That systems do not respond to individuals as individuals. They respond to what individuals represent, what they threaten, what the response to them can be made to mean for an audience larger than the room you're sitting in. She had spent 3 years analyzing exactly this dynamic from the outside, in essays and seminars and voice notes recorded while walking. She had never analyzed it from inside a laminate table room while wearing yesterday's clothes and smelling faintly of a holding cell. It lands differently from inside. She was released on conditional bail that afternoon. The conditions were precise and extensive. She could not attend any public demonstration, could not contact any member of the royal family or royal household directly or indirectly, could not travel outside England and Wales, had to report to a police station every Monday and Thursday. She walked out of the building into a November afternoon that was the same gray and damp as the one she had walked into, and she stood on the pavement for a moment with her coat and her phone and nothing else, and the first thing she saw was a photographer 20 meters away with a lens pointed at her face. She had not prepared for this. In all the years of political organizing, she had thought about visibility as a tool, something you sought when you needed it, something you deployed strategically. She had not thought about it as something that could happen to you, without your management, without your control, in all directions at once. She had 4,000 Instagram followers. She had never been in a national newspaper. She had never had a photographer waiting outside a building for her. By that evening, she had been on the front page of every national newspaper in Britain. By the following morning, she had been in papers in 37 countries. Her face, the one the police camera had caught as the officers led her away, the one where she was looking directly forward with an expression that read, depending on who was looking, as defiance or shock or calculation or grief, was the most circulated news image in the world for 72 hours. People decided who she was before she said a single word in public. The first category of decision was simple. She was a criminal. Not just legally, that was not in dispute, but morally, categorically, as a type of person. The conservative press ran her as a specimen of a generation without manners, without respect, without the basic civic glue that held a society together. Opinion columns asked what had happened to Britain. Radio phone-ins ran for 3 days straight, with callers describing her as disgusting, as a disgrace, as evidence of everything that was wrong with left-wing politics and university education and social media and the cost of things not being what they used to be. Her mother's address in Swindon was identified and published in one tabloid before it was taken down following complaint. Her university dissertation was obtained somehow and quoted out of context in 2 separate news pieces. The second category of decision was more complicated and more uncomfortable for Camilla to navigate. She was a hero. Not universally, not even majoritarily, but loudly, persistently across a significant portion of the internet and a significant portion of the people who had been at the demonstration that day, and a significant portion of the people who were old, or sick, or cold, or afraid, or watching their parents get older, and sicker, and colder, and more afraid, while the sovereign grant went up 7%, and their benefits went down. Her Instagram gained 60,000 followers in 48 hours. People left comments that said, "Thank you," and "You said what we couldn't," and "They'll make an example of you, but we see you." She did not know what to do with either version of herself. She went back to Swindon because the flat she rented in Bristol had a tabloid photographer camped outside it. Her mother met her at the door without speaking, took her coat, made tea with the automatic precision of someone who processes crisis through the production of hot beverages, and did not bring up what had happened until both cups were on the table and the television was off. "Are you okay?" her mother said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know," Camilla said, which was more honest than almost anything she had said to anyone in the previous 3 days. Her mother wrapped both hands around her mug. She was 54 and looked at the specific kind of 54 that comes from years of working hard at things that pay less than they should, from worrying about money with the focus of someone who cannot afford to look away from it, from raising a daughter alone after the father left when the daughter was 16, and the leaving was quiet and total and never adequately explained. "I need you to understand something," her mother said. She waited. "I understand why you did it. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand why you did it. I've spent 30 years being angry about the same things you're angry about, and I know exactly what that anger feels like, and I know where it comes from, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's wrong to feel it." A pause. The mug turned between her palms. "But I need you to understand that understanding why you did it is not the same as being glad you did it. And I'm not glad. I am very frightened. And I need you to not make me choose between the two of those things right now, because I can't." Camilla looked at her mother and felt something shift behind her sternum, a slow, seismic thing like a wall moving a fraction of an inch. "Okay," she said. "Okay," her mother said. They drank their tea. The weeks between the arrest and the preliminary hearing had a particular texture, stretched and airless, like the silence before a large piece of furniture topples. Camilla was not idle in them. She worked with Priya and the second lawyer, whose name was Saoirse, and who specialized in cases involving political expression and state power, on building the framework of her defense. The defense was not going to be, "I didn't do it." There were 40 witnesses and 2 camera crews. The defense was going to be something more complicated, something that lived at the intersection of law and politics, and the specific question of what it meant to prosecute a woman for an act of dissent under a statute designed for a different century. Saoirse laid it out on a whiteboard in the firm's conference room on a Tuesday afternoon, with Camilla and Priya and a junior solicitor named Marcus who said very little but wrote everything down. "There are 3 angles," Saoirse said. "One is proportionality, the argument that pursuing a maximum or near maximum sentence under this statute for what amounts to a political protest constitutes a disproportionate exercise of state power and potentially infringes Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, which protects freedom of expression. 2 is context, the argument that the circumstances of the act, specifically the location, the political demonstration, the public nature of the grievance being expressed, are relevant, mitigating factors that place this in a different category from a private act of violence or aggression. Asterisk 3 is the one the prosecution will hate most, Saoirse said, and she had the slight energy of someone who had been waiting to say this, asterisk, which is the constitutional argument. The statute itself, its scope, its application to political expression in a democratic society, its compatibility with contemporary human rights law, is arguable. We are not the first lawyers to look at this statute and find the edges soft. We might be the first to push on them in open court. Asterisk, you want to challenge the law itself, asterisk, Camilla said. I want to make the Crown defend it, asterisk, Saoirse said. Asterisk, which is different, and considerably more expensive for them, politically. Asterisk, Marcus wrote everything down. Camilla drove back to Swindon that evening thinking about what it meant to become a test case. She had studied test cases in university, the cases where individual people became the vehicle through which law was examined and sometimes remade, where a single set of facts opened a constitutional question that had been waiting, pressurized for exactly the right moment to demand an answer. She had written about them with the calm, analytical interest of a student at a safe distance from the material. She was no longer at a safe distance from the material. She was the material. The preliminary hearing was set for January. In the weeks leading up to it, the political landscape shifted in ways that made the pressure on her case heavier, not lighter. The government, facing a polling collapse, partly driven by the benefits cuts coverage, leaned harder into the law and order framing of her arrest. The Home Secretary gave 2 separate interviews in which he referenced respect for our institutions and the rule of law in ways that were clearly about her case without naming it. A backbench MP proposed a motion in the Commons calling for the maximum sentencing provisions of the statute to be reviewed and strengthened, which generated 3 days of parliamentary debate and the specific bizarre experience for Camilla of watching politicians debate a law as it applied to her while she sat on her mother's sofa watching it on the television. Her mother watched it with her. Neither of them spoke. The second thing that shifted was inside herself, and it was harder to map than the political landscape because she did not have the analytical framework for it. Because it was not political, it was personal. It was the slow unwinding of certainty that happens when you have done something irreversible and live inside the aftermath long enough to start seeing it from all the angles, not just the one you were standing at when you did it. She did not regret the anger. She was clear about that, even in the hardest moments. The anger was real, was sourced in real things, was the same anger that had animated her entire adult life, and that she did not believe she was wrong to feel. But she thought about Queen Charlotte, the specific human being, not the institution. 81 years old. She had been reading about her. Not the ceremonial record, not the official biography, but the pieces people wrote about her in more personal registers, the letters she had written over 60 years of public life that had been published in various collections, the interviews she had given in the 1990s before she became guarded, before the institution closed around her like a shell. There was a woman in those pieces. There was someone who had grown up in a particular world with a particular set of constraints, and who had navigated them for 8 decades with the instruments available to her. Camilla did not agree with the institution that woman represented. She did not walk back a single political position, but she thought about being 81 and having a stranger spit on you through a car window, and she thought about the distance between the system she had been attacking and the body the spit had landed on, and she did not know what to do with the discomfort that lived in that distance. She did not talk about this with anyone. Not with Priya, not with Saoirse, not with the collective members who had been calling and texting with solidarity and political commentary in equal measure. Not with her mother. She wrote it in a notebook at 2 in the morning instead, in the Swindon Row house, in the specific privacy of sleeplessness. And then she closed the notebook and did not read it back. The hearing came. The hearing was not the trial. It was a machinery of the trial being assembled in public, the charges confirmed, the pleas entered, the dates set. But the courtroom was full. The press were in the gallery. Outside the court, 2 groups of people with signs stood on opposite sides of the road and shouted things at each other that the police monitored with practiced boredom. Camilla stood and said her name. She said she understood the charges. She entered her plea. Not guilty. She said it clearly, in a voice she used for the voice notes, the voice she had cultivated through years of knowing that how you say something is also what you say, and the plea was legally and politically accurate. She was not pleading not guilty to the fact of what she had done, but to the framing of what it meant, to the specific charge that what she had done warranted the weight of this particular law, and this particular system bearing down on one 23-year-old woman from a town the color of dishwater. The magistrate set the trial date for April. Camilla walked out of the courtroom into the February cold, and the photographers and the 2 groups with their signs, and she stood on the steps for a moment before Priya took her arm and moved her toward the car, and she looked at the group on the left, the one with the signs that said lock her up and respect the crown, and then at the group on the right, the one that said free Camilla and dissent is not a crime. And she thought, neither of those signs is about me. Both of those signs are about something true. She got in the car. April was coming. Everything was coming. She had not yet learned to be afraid of it in the right way. The specific, quiet fear that settles in the body when you understand that the outcome is genuinely uncertain, that the story does not have a determined ending, that the door you walk through on a Tuesday morning in November leads somewhere that nobody, not the lawyers, not the politicians, not the commentators who had been filling column inches with certainty for months, nobody can see the end of. That fear arrived later. It arrived in March when the Crown Prosecution Service filed its sentencing submissions, and she sat in Priya's office reading the pages and understood in a way that was different from understanding it as a legal abstraction, that the people who wanted to make an example of her had access to tools that made an example out of a person very effectively, and that the tool they had reached for was very old and very heavy and had a number on it that could swallow a whole life if it landed. Wrong. She read the number. She put the pages down on the desk. She did not say anything for a long time. Camilla, Asterisk Priya said. I know, Asterisk, she said. She knew. She had known since the officer's hand on her arm, since the phone call to her mother, since the first moment she understood that 1 second had become everything, and that everything was now waiting for her in a courtroom in April with 12 people in a jury box who would decide whether the thing she had carried all her life and released in one unplanned moment on a gray Tuesday was a political act or a criminal one, whether it was speech or violence, whether she was a woman pushed past a point or a woman without limits, whether she was an example of something broken or something true. The decision was not hers to make. It had not been hers for a long time. April in London smells like wet stone and diesel and the particular kind of optimism that British people manufacture in spring against all reasonable evidence that the weather will cooperate. The trees outside the Crown Court on that first morning had the pale, tentative green of leaves that are not yet certain they should be there. The sky was the color of an old bruise healing. Camilla Ashworth sat in the back of a black cab with Priya on one side and Saoirse on the other and watched the city pass outside the window and thought, this is it. Not with drama, not with the clean internal clarity of a film montage, with the flat, slightly nauseated factuality of a person who has been moving toward a specific door for 5 months and is now close enough to see the grain of the wood. There were more photographers outside the court than she had expected. She had known there would be photographers. She had been photographed entering rooms since November. But the scale of it, the dense press of them, the sheer quantity of lenses all pointed at the same 20 meters of pavement, landed differently than she was prepared for. It was the scale of attention reserved for people who have become, without applying for the position, a public spectacle. She walked through it with her chin level and her hands still and her face arranged in the specific non-expression that Priya had quietly coached her toward over the previous weeks. Not defiance, which read as arrogance. Not contrition, which read as an admission the legal team was not yet ready to make. Just the neutral, forward-facing calm of a person who is present, who is composed, who has not decided yet what she wants the cameras to see. Inside smelled like old carpet and institutional anxiety. The trial lasted 11 days. This is how it went. The prosecution called their witnesses in a particular order, with a particular discipline of people who have assembled a narrative and are delivering it with precision. Beginning with the protection officers who were closest to the car, who described the sequence of events in the clipped, factual register of trained witnesses. The forward motion of the defendant, the arm extension, the contact, the immediate response. Their testimony was seamless. It was meant to be. What happened was not in dispute. It had never been in dispute. Then, the prosecution called a royal household official who testified about the effect of the incident on Queen Charlotte, who was not present, whose medical team had submitted a written statement about the distress and the precautionary health assessment that followed, the heightened security protocols, the disruption to her engagements for the following 2 weeks. The written statement was read aloud in the courtroom. Camilla listened to it. She sat at the defense table and listened to a description of an 81-year-old woman in the back of a car in the seconds after something had come through the 3-inch gap at her window, and she felt the specific discomfort that she had been managing since the night she wrote in the notebook and closed it without reading it back. The recognition that the distance between an institution and the human being who embodied it was not infinite, was not a comfortable and navigating distance, but a very small gap through which an act aimed at one had landed on the other. She kept her face level. Priya's hand was very still on the table beside her. The prosecution's final witness was an expert in constitutional law, an academic from King's College who walked the jury through the statute, its history, its previous applications, its legislative intent. He was precise and authoritative and slightly condescending in a way that academics are sometimes slightly condescending without noticing. And he made the case that the statute existed for exactly these situations, that the protection of the sovereign from acts of physical disrespect was not a historical curiosity, but a living legal principle, and that the location of the act in public, in front of cameras, at a moment of political demonstration, did not mitigate it but aggravated it. The public nature of the act, he said, Asterisk is what elevates it from personal grievance to political threat. It is a performance. It is a statement that the sovereign is not owed dignity in public space. The law exists, in part, to answer that statement. Asterisk the jury wrote things down. Then, Saoirse stood up. What Saoirse did over the following 4 days was not loud. It was not theatrical. It did not generate the dramatic moments that courtroom scenes in films generate, with their speeches and their revelations and their turning point silences. It was patient. It was methodical. It was the application of very precise pressure to very specific points, the way a structural engineer identifies load-bearing elements and then asks calmly over and over how much weight can this actually hold. She called her own constitutional expert, who was older than the prosecution's and considerably less condescending, and who walked the jury through the same statute from the other direction. Its age, its anachronism, its original context of monarchy as absolute political power, rather than constitutional symbol, the significant legal question of whether a statute designed for one kind of sovereignty was appropriate for another kind entirely. She called a political scientist who had spent 20 years studying protest movements and who testified about the documented relationship between economic inequality and political expression, about the specific conditions of the cost of living crisis, about what the research showed about how ordinary people communicate political grievance when they feel that formal channels have failed them. She called 3 character witnesses. Camilla's professor from Bristol, Dr. Osei, who was measured and credible, and said simply that in 8 years of teaching he had not encountered a student more serious about understanding systems of power and less motivated by personal advancement or attention. A community organizer from Bristol who had worked alongside Camilla for 4 years and described her not as a political operator, but as someone who genuinely lost sleep about the people the system was failing. And Camilla's mother, who came to London in her good coat and sat in the witness box and answered Saoirse's questions in the same voice she used for everything. The voice that had no artifice in it. The voice of a woman who had been honest her whole life because she could not afford the energy it took to be otherwise. Saoirse asked, "How would you describe your daughter?" Her mother said, "Serious. Too serious, probably, for her own peace. She cares about things more than is comfortable." Saoirse asked, "Did you raise her to respect the law?" Her mother said, I raise her to understand that the law is not the same thing as justice, which is not the same as disrespecting it. It means knowing the difference. The prosecution did not make much headway on cross-examination. Camilla took the stand on day 8. She had spent 4 evenings preparing with Priya, not rehearsing a script because scripted witnesses were detectable and counterproductive, but working through the things she needed to be clear about and the things she needed to be careful about and the specific tone she needed to maintain throughout, which was the tone of someone being completely honest without being combative, answering what was asked without volunteering ammunition. She was in the box for 2.5 hours. The prosecution's barrister, a man in his 50s named Whitmore, who had the careful, unhurried precision of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that the most effective cross-examination looks like a conversation, walked her through the day carefully, in sequence, asking about her motivations, her intentions, the organization she was affiliated with, her history of political activism. He did not raise his voice. He did not attempt to shake her. He asked questions in a tone of mild, persistent interest, and the questions accumulated. "You describe this as a political act," he said. "Yes," she said. "A deliberately public one." Yes. You understood when you did it that you were in front of cameras. I knew the demonstration had been filmed. I was not thinking about cameras specifically. But you understood your action would be seen. I don't think I was calculating what would be seen. I think I acted and then understanding came after. You acted without thinking. I acted before thinking was possible. That's different. He paused at that. Is it? He said. Not a question. A note. He moved on. He asked about Queen Charlotte specifically. He asked whether she had considered the personal impact on an elderly woman. He asked it carefully, without loading it with evident judgment, which made it more effective than if he had loaded it. Camilla answered him. She said, I was not thinking about the individual. I was thinking about the institution. I understand that distinction is not morally clean. I have thought about it a great deal since November. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it doesn't matter that the person I acted against was a human being and not a symbol. It matters. I know it matters. But my political position, my objection to what the monarchy represents in the context of cuts that are hurting real people, that is not changed by the fact that I also now carry the weight of what it feels like to have aimed something at a system and hit a person. Asterisk, the courtroom was quiet. Whitmore looked at his notes. That's an interesting way to put it. Asterisk, he said. It's the true way. Asterisk, she said. The jury went out on a Thursday afternoon. They came back on a Saturday morning. 2 days and 3 hours of deliberation for 11 days of evidence, and 5 months of a case that the entire country had been watching and arguing about with the specific, exhausting intensity of a culture that processes its contradictions in public. Camilla sat with her mother in the waiting area. Her mother had a paper cup of coffee that she did not drink. Camilla had nothing. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and the flat, slightly nauseated factuality that she had been carrying since the first morning, and she thought about very little. She had run out of productive thoughts 2 days earlier. What was left was just the body, sitting, just the waiting. Priya appeared at the door. They're back. Asterisk, she said. The walk from the waiting area to the courtroom was short. It did not feel short. The courtroom was the fullest it had been. Every press seat taken. The public gallery packed. The energy of a room that has been building toward a moment for 2.5 months and can finally feel the moment arriving. The jury filed in. Camilla looked at their faces and read nothing. Jury faces are professionally unreadable by the time they return. They have lived inside a decision long enough to become it. And the decision is not readable from outside until the foreman speaks. The foreman stood. On the charge of assault on the sovereign, how do you find the defendant? Asterisk, the foreman was a woman in her 60s. She had neat gray hair and small gold earrings, and she held the paper steady. She said, not guilty. The courtroom did not explode. It fractured. Different people responding differently, and simultaneously, sharp exhale from the press row, a sound from somewhere in the public gallery that was not quite a cheer, because the acoustics of a courtroom arrest sounds before they fully form, Saoirse's hand landing briefly on the table, Priya's head dropping forward by 2 inches, and then back up. Camilla sat very still. Her mother, in the row behind her, made a sound. Just one. Small. The sound of something that had been held for a long time, being very carefully put down. The judge said several things that Camilla heard without processing. The prosecution's barrister gathered his papers with the particular stillness of a man who has lost and will not show it. The foreman sat down. The procedural conclusion of the trial moved through its necessary stages. Camilla sat with her hands in her lap and felt the verdict move through her body like water, finding a level. Not relief, not triumph, not the clean, bright thing that people who had been on her side were going to perform on the steps outside in about 20 minutes. Something more complicated. Something that had the weight of 2 years of her life inside it. 2 years of becoming a public fact, of existing in the gap between institution and person, of watching her face on every front page and hearing herself described as everything and its opposite, of sitting in her mother's living room at 2 in the morning, writing things in a notebook she would not read back. Something that felt like the end of one thing without the clear beginning of another. Saoirse leaned toward her. Camilla. Asterisk, she said quietly. We need to step outside. She nodded. She stood. She walked out through the door into the corridor, and then through the corridor into the April air, and the photographers, and the 2 groups with their signs who were still there, still on opposite sides of the road, still shouting things at each other across the street. The group on the right cheered when they saw her. She stood on the steps, and she looked at them, at the signs that said Free Camilla, and Dissent is not a crime, and she thought about the word free. About what it meant now, about what she was free of and what she would carry regardless, about the blue stain that washes out and the thing that doesn't, about the fact that a verdict is a legal determination and not the same thing as a conclusion, that the question the trial had asked, what does it mean to aim something at a system and hit a person, was not answered by the jury's decision, only by the long work of being alive with it. Her mother came to stand beside her on the steps. She did not take her hand. She just stood there, in her good coat, squinting slightly in the pale spring light. Below them, the photographer shot. Across the road, both groups were loud. The trees had their tentative green. The sky was a slightly better version of the bruise color, healing more visibly, moving the way skies do whether you're watching or not, towards something that is not yet here but is, given enough time, coming. Camilla exhaled. One long breath. Not the end. The place where the story becomes the rest of her life.